Hello. In this Ben Talk, I present you findings from my senior thesis on poverty and aspirations. So, in this research project, I asked three main research questions uh, pertaining to the Indian context and pertaining to young children between the ages of 12 to 15. So, the first question is whether aspirations vary significantly among different social groups. And so, whether there are some social groups that have lower aspirations than the others. The second question is whether aspirations are formed internally or externally, through which channel are they formed. And the third question is whether aspirations are significant in the context of poverty and whether they actually could lead to the development of a poverty trap. So, to begin with, I define aspirations as Debraj Ray defines them. They are individual desires and behaviors which are socially conditioned. Their aspirations can occur along various dimensions: educational, occupational, where you want to live. I restrict my aspirations to occupational aspirations because, based on some research, there's found to be the better determinants of social status. So, to start with, the first finding is that the means for aspirations vary significantly among groups and categories. So, the categories that I've identified are caste, scheduled caste versus not, gender, male and female, religion, Hindu or not, rural or urban area of living, and language, whether you speak Telugu or not, because this is the South Indian context. And based on two sample t-tests, it's all these categories found that the means for aspiration level vary significantly within these groups. And now the relevance of this finding is that aspirational level is a distinguishing feature among different groups, and it is indeed something that creates a difference. And so it is a socially relevant metric. Now, the second question seeks to explore whether aspirations are formed internally, that is, whether they're formed through the metrics of what an individual's identity is, what an individual thinks their behavior should be based on their membership in a certain social group, or whether they're formed externally through access, in the sense of its aspirations are more of a calculated measure based on what resources they have and what they think the best way to make use of them is. Now, in order to answer the second question, I regress aspiration level on the above identified categorical variables as different identity metrics. And then I add another metric, which is the wealth index, which is a composite of housing quality, access to services, and asset ownership, as another metric to measure access of individuals to measure the resources they have. And so regressing these variables together on aspiration level allows me to identify the perhaps confounding effects that were not noted in the earlier analysis, and B, it allows me to identify the internal and external channel. Now, after this regression, two variables, which is location of the child, rural or urban, and religion, Hindu or not, both of those are not statistically significant p-values, and so it's probably because of a confounding effect that they were shown to have different means. For example, perhaps all the people who lived in rural area, lower aspirations perhaps was influenced by the fact that perhaps in rural areas people spoke a certain language, or they were of a certain caste which has lower aspirations, and so controlling for the other variables, rural urban no longer is a significant indicator of aspiration levels. So removing those two from an analysis, we now are left with three metrics for group identity, which is gender, a language, and caste. So before I discuss those, I want to discuss the wealth index, which has a coefficient of 10, which means that on increasing the wealth index from 0 to 1, the aspirational value that a child has increases by 10 points. And therefore, someone who has a wealth index of 1 is likely to have a 10-point higher aspirational level than someone with a wealth index of 0. And this is statistically significant p-value of 0.000. And So this shows that external channel in the development of aspirations is clearly evident. But uh, let's look at the internal channel now. So let's start with caste. Whether caste has a coefficient of minus 1.45, which indicates that if someone from a lower caste, which is a scheduled caste, other caste, or backward caste, or scheduled tribe, not other caste, um, is likely to have 1.5 lower value than someone who is from the other castes. Okay, and this is marginally significant with a p-value of 0.07, but this shows that even controlling for access variables, just the presence of caste leads to differing outcomes, indicating that there is an internal channel, just membership of a group, that also leads to aspirational development. The other group memberships that lead to variance are language, which is whether or not you speak Telugu, and people who speak Telugu have a lower aspirational level. But this is not necessarily, this is a trickier variable to interpret because it doesn't come down just to access, but also it doesn't just come down to identity, but also access, because language determines the information you can have and the kind of jobs you can work in. Similarly, gender, girls actually have higher aspiration level with a coefficient of 5.6 than boys do. And this is interesting. Again, this doesn't come down just to identity, because there's a lot of research showing that within a family, girls are often discriminated against and get fewer resources than boys do. But despite this, they have a higher aspirational level. So this is an interesting insight for further research. Now, after finding this, these findings are relevant because they can determine whether an internal channel or an external channel should be targeted and interventions regarding aspirations. Now, are aspirations even relevant, especially when it comes to poverty? So, a poverty trap is poverty that is self-reinforcing due to poor's equilibrium behavior. It refers to an idea that there exist circumstances in which an individual, once poor, will always remain poor. So, in the context of aspirations, a poverty trap would mean because an individual is poor, they have low aspirations. Because they have low aspirations, they will remain poor. Now, this is an additional relevance to aspiration, and while it's hard to determine causality, I try and explore Debraj Ray's theoretical understanding of a poverty trap. Now, Debraj Ray says that a poverty trap occurs in through aspirations and through the form of fatalism, which is when the gap between what an individual aspires to and what the individual currently is at is so large that the aspirations don't occur, and through this gap, poverty is perpetuated. And through my research, I tried to find whether the difference. I created a measure for the difference between a parent's expectations of the child's outcome and the child's aspirational level. And through this difference, I created a metric for an aspiration gap, and I regressed it with a self-identified agency metric, which said, I believe that if I work hard, I can improve my situation in life. Strongly agree or agree. So, showing the strength of how much strongly agree or don't agree. And the finding found that the relationship between an aspirational gap was correlated negatively with agency, which goes to show that indeed aspirations do have some sort of a relationship with poverty. And that's all. Thank you.